I think most people would agree that the Hobbit movies are pretty bad. And if you don't agree, get out. Just kidding, please stay here to the end, I love you all. But it's really hard to tell an epic tale about dwarves trying to slay a dragon when you include things like a Looney Tunes goblin fight, Bomber rolling over orcs with a barrel, and Radagast showing up with poop on his face. But see, those things aren't really the problem. I mean, they are problems. Don't get me wrong, these movies are absolute lazy trash on their own right. But the bigger issue is that these movies just fundamentally misunderstand the point of The Hobbit. See, I kind of tricked you when I said that it's an epic tale about dwarves trying to slay a dragon. That's what Peter Jackson seems to think the story's about, but it's not. It's about something else. So when the movies tell an epic tale about dwarves trying to slay a dragon who's like in league with Sauron or whatever, they're telling a totally different story. So today I'm going to talk about why. It's an interesting example of how badly an adaptation can miss the point of its source material, as well as a literary atrocity that kept an entire generation from understanding The Hobbit. So I hope you enjoy. Before I start, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you're willing and think you're able to support, please go check out my Patreon. These videos are operating with almost no ad revenue due to me making videos I think are going to be good without much concern for the algorithm or gaining a lot of views. So if you think that these videos are worth it, consider whether you could offer a little money to help me cover my expenses. If you can't, if you don't have money aside and you're living paycheck to paycheck or need to save a little, please stay away, I beg of you, but a little bit will go a long way. Anyway, back to The Hobbit. So what's this book about anyway? If it's not about dwarves and a dragon, then what's going on here? Well, basically it's about the idea of adventure. More specifically, how modern people relate to the idea of adventure. And it gets this across by depicting a character named Bilbo Baggins as having most of the traits of a modern person, then showing him being exposed to an adventure. Almost the entire story is told from his perspective and is constantly wrestling with two questions. Will Bilbo choose to step up to be an adventurer, and does he have what it takes to do so? So the book uses Bilbo and his dilemma to play with the ideas of modernity versus adventure. But it also does this through the setting. See, there are a couple sides to Middle-earth and The Hobbit. And I should add, by the way, that whenever I talk about Middle-earth in this video, I'm talking about Middle-earth as depicted in The Hobbit, not Lord of the Rings. Yes, those are technically the same world and all their lore ties in together, but the depiction in The Hobbit is different in emphasis and what it did and didn't include, and that's kind of an important distinction. On one hand, it's this old-timey fanciful world of magic and adventure that Bilbo has to strike out into, but on the other, we're constantly being shown signs that it's in transition itself. It's not as pure as it used to be, the old warrior ways are fading, and all the races in Middle-earth are shown transitioning to some form of modern capitalism, to put it bluntly. Hobbits live comfortable consumer lives, men are worried primarily with commerce, dwarves are reduced from fine craftsmen to industrial laborers, and goblins have become obsessed with making the engines of war that will eventually become modern-day weapons. Only the elves are mostly untouched by this and seem to represent the purest ideal of old-timey magic and lore. Then we have the most brutal, drastic sign of change. The dragons who sweep across the land, consolidating wealth and creating environmental devastation everywhere they go. In short, we're always being shown this clash between modernity and some bygone age of heroism and magic. Bilbo, the analog for modern man, being thrust into that world, and the world itself being subjected to the march of time as modern practices encroach upon it. I hesitate to say that any book is about one thing, but if The Hobbit addresses one idea, this is pretty close to it, or at least it's central to what the book's trying to do. But the movies show very little awareness of these themes and do everything in their power to shift the focus away from them. How do they do that? Well, let's break it down, shall we? Number 1. From the very start, they frame The Hobbit as an epic tale of the dwarves' quest instead of a story about Bilbo discovering adventure. Like I said, The Hobbit is a tale about, well, a hobbit. That should be clear. It's all about how Bilbo discovers and adapts to adventure, which is why it opens from his perspective. And this choice is important. By showing us Bilbo living his pleasant little life in the Shire and then suddenly having Gandalf show up to reveal all this stuff about dwarves and dragons and gold, Tolkien establishes two things. That this story is about Bilbo, and that the adventure is just something that happens to come to his attention. See, and this might be kind of a hot take, the whole thing about dwarves and their quest was kind of incidental. Tolkien needed Gandalf to bring some adventure to Bilbo's doorstep, and this was just the one he chose. It could have been anything. Men needing help driving off an evil wizard, elves needing help ridding the woods of spiders, spiders needing help ridding the woods of elves. As long as it presented Bilbo with an adventure that both scared him and excited him so we could see how he'd react, the core point of the story would still be the same. And his reaction is key. No matter what the dwarves say, Chapter 1 keeps us inside Bilbo's head, revealing how their tale scares him, how it excites him, how it relates to other stories he's heard. We're learning along with him. Our idea of the world and the adventure grows as his grows, which subordinates the adventure to his perception of the adventure. The movie, however, does the opposite. Before we even meet Bilbo, and I mean present-day Bilbo, it presents us this super dramatic cinematic backstory of how Smaug attacked the dwarves and drove them away. Now I can get the appeal of this. It brings the audience right into some super intense action, which is a very Hollywood thing to do, and also feels like the opening to the Lord of the Rings movies, thus hailing back to an established franchise, also a very Hollywood thing to do. But this drastically changes the focus of the story. From the very start, it shifts the framing from Bilbo discovers adventure and Gandalf brings some dwarves to take him on one to there's this important epic quest and the Hobbit is going to go along. And because it's framed by old Lord of the Rings Bilbo writing his story while Frodo walks by, it adds an additional layer to the whole thing. That being, this important epic quest resides within the world of an even more important epic narrative, basically burying what should be Bilbo's story under one more layer of something else. Now, I'm not saying that this one choice single-handedly ruined the movie and couldn't have been made to work. Like Star Wars did something similar, right? It started with an epic space battle before zooming in on Luke. But once it did that, it made it clear that the story was about Luke. So maybe The Hobbit could have succeeded if it had done the same. But the problem is, this was just the first step in famously sidelining Bilbo, and it sent the audience a message of who this movie was really about. It was also just a shame to see such a well-crafted beginning that put the focus on him in such a smart way torn down willy-nilly for no reason other than cheap thrills. Anyway, speaking of altering things for no reason other than cheap thrills, number 2. They changed the nature of Middle-earth and the races who lived there. Tolkien put a lot of thought into the races that inhabit the Hobbit. He didn't just kind of whip out human-like creatures with broad characteristics like these are the short, stout, mining ones and these are the tall, arrow-shooting, artsy ones. He populated his story with a rich assortment of cultures that brought Middle-earth alive, that showed it as this place, as I said before, that was in transition. This made how all these races were characterized pretty integral to the tone and even themes of the story. If you don't understand this, you're kind of just charging into your adaptation blind. And with every change you make to these races, you're kind of pulling out one little thread here, one little thread there that slowly unravels this rich tapestry that Tolkien created. Unfortunately, this is exactly what the Hobbit movies do. It seems like Peter Jackson was just totally oblivious to what made these races work in the story, so he just kind of willy-nilly adjusted them to make them more dramatic, or actiony, or silly, or Lord of the Ringsy. As long as they had their broadest identifying characteristics, they could be flattened out into whatever provided the most easily digestible entertainment value for the widest possible audience. If the movies felt paper thin to you, this is probably a big reason why. The cultures just don't feel real and they provide very little dramatic thrust to the story. Now the Hobbits seem more or less safe from this, which kind of makes sense. Their traits are pretty straightforward and were made a pop culture fixture by Lord of the Rings movies that more or less respected them, even if they were ribbed on and memified a bit. This could have done a lot to salvage the movies if, the main Hobbit character hadn't been sidelined. Now the other races don't survive quite as well. The elves are flattened out and, frankly, made pretty boring. The elves of the book are this multi-layered race with a variety of cultures. They generally have a strong connection with nature, are familiar with old lore, and often are fun. I mean, the first we see of them, they're in the trees laughing and singing playful songs as the dwarves as they approach Rivendell. This all hails back to a rich, fanciful past and gives a lot of character to the world that Bilbo's striking out into. But none of this comes across as the movies because Peter Jackson just kind of inserts his Lord of the Rings elves into the story. This means that the most ancient major race of the Hobbit has one trait, which is being stoic, and I guess also better than everybody else at everything because they're so ancient and wise. This, along with always presenting them with this unnecessarily heavy-handed sense of gravitas, just robs the world and the story of a lot of its character. Now, I wasn't a big fan of the elves in Lord of the Rings, but at least they fit better there with its, really serious story. Everything's about this serious mission to get rid of the rings, and so some serious elves make sense there. But to just copy and paste them from the Lord of the Rings into the Hobbit is just so tone-deaf, it's kind of mind-blowing to me. I don't get it. The portrayal of the dwarves is even more overtly offensive. I mean, sure, they have most of the really broad strokes traits from the book. They're a little stubborn and uncultured. They really like digging and having a lot of gold. They have that ancient warrior tribe feel to them. But in any particular scene, where the real characterization happens, the movies tend to go one of two ways with them. They make them human or they make them silly. Now, we all know that they're not all given dwarf makeup. Weird choice, but okay. But they're also humanized by being characterized with generic stereotypes. We have the wise old one, the one that seems coded as having brain damage, the stupid one, the fat one, the immature horny one, the uncultured lout, and Aragorn. These traits have nothing to do with being a dwarf and are such familiar tropes that to a human audience they kind of read as being human. They also reduce each dwarf to a humorous visual signifier, if not an outright recurring joke. Flat characterization is an inherently unserious way to handle a character. When those characteristics are silly, you're telling everybody that those characters are comic relief. And these movies lean into this hard. The dwarves are often shown behaving frivolously with no sign of social awareness. And this is done specifically to get laughs from the audience. I mean, by the time we reach Rivendell, early in the first movie and third chapter in the book, we see them going into someone else's home, acting like obnoxious children who don't even have basic table manners. And how do you come back from treating your protagonists as such absolute buffoons? This is if the story even meant to come back from it, even if it dialed this back at all, which it didn't that much. And the problem is this doesn't just ruin the dwarves. It ruins the main point of the story. Because the dwarves, they're not just there, they have a central dramatic function in the book. I said that the whole dwarf and the dragon thing is kind of incidental, and it is, but once they're there, they serve a purpose for Bilbo and his journey into adventure. And that is that they're foils for Bilbo. They're the ancient warrior craftsmen that Bilbo feels intimidated by at first and must ultimately try to measure up to. And the book has fun with them, I'm not going to try to deny that. But at its core, it takes them seriously. And I mean it takes their positive and their negative traits seriously. They are at turns capable and hot-headed, resolute and greedy, brave and lacking in imagination. Bilbo, on the other hand, is weaker and a little more tentative, but he's also more level-headed and imaginative. And so at the core of the story is this question of how he with his traits can find a place among them with their traits. This is what signifies that he's progressing as an adventurer. But it's hard to show where he's at on this journey when he's thrown in with and trying to measure up against people who fluctuate between Jar Jar level comic relief and over-the-top action heroes. I can run through the other races pretty quickly. The goblins and wargs of the book are largely treated as these swarms that organically rise up here or there or attack this or that town. Yes, they react to things and have vendettas, but for the most part they feel organic and kind of just part of the wider world. Also, they're shown to be different races and cultures from each other. Tolkien develops them independently and shows them acting independently, even if they sometimes work together. Now, in the movies, the goblins often become silly, surprise, surprise, but they also, equally surprise, surprise, are often turned into Lord of the Rings orcs. They're often guided by or working with Sauron, they have an identifiable leader, and throughout the movies, they are making a concerted effort to chase the dwarves. Also, the wargs are just kind of reduced to being orc horses. The Eagles have a similar issue in the movies in that their actions revolve around the main characters and their quest. They show up to save the heroes from the top of the trees because Gandalf calls them, get it, like in Lord of the Rings? But in the book, the Eagles don't necessarily even like the main characters. They just see orcs and wargs making fires and decide to fly down and f*** them up because they like them even less. Basically, everything the peripheral races do centers too much on the main characters. The Eagles show up because they know Gandalf. The orcs show up and chase the dwarves because they know Thorin and I guess are working for Sauron. So when everything in the world feels like it's not rising up organically, that it's all happening because people know the main characters and are reacting to them, it just makes the world feel really small. Also, it just kind of messes with the dramatic thrust of the story, but I'll get into that more later. Oh, and dragons are just plain underdeveloped, but again, get into that later. Number 3. They turn characters into Lord of the Rings characters. This issue is the same as what happened with a lot of Middle-earth's races. These movies basically just reused Lord of the Rings assets or reshape things according to its template. So we have Thorin becoming another Aragorn, Gandalf becoming Lord of the Rings Gandalf, Azog becoming a big iconic orc captain, the Necromancer becoming straight up Sauron, and Legolas being in the movie. Now let me get the necromancer one out of the way from the start, because I know I might get a lot of well-actualing about saying that he's out of place in these movies, especially represented as being Sauron. Yes, I know that within Tolkien's universe, the necromancer is Sauron, but that's not who he was when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, and that's not how he's represented in this book. So shifting him to that does a lot to change this from a Hobbit story to a pre-Lord of the Rings story. I will get into that a lot more later. Now, Thorin being turned into Aragorn is a famously obvious shift in his character, and it doesn't do the story any favors. Once again, we are calling back to Lord of the Rings instead of letting The Hobbit have room to be its own story, because of course. And it really just flattens his character. It kind of boils him down to this overly serious, brooding, once and future king who carries the burden of his people on his shoulders. This is a pretty one-dimensional character trait, and when you're always flipping back and forth between that and the dwarves just being silly characters, you get tonal whiplash and it's hard to know how to ground yourself with them. It also calls back to Lord of the Rings in one other way, which is that it reduces his greed to this clownish, ambiguously magical gold sickness. Now, his greed was represented in a pretty on-the-nose way in the books, I'm not going to deny that, but it was still handled as a natural and consistently developing part of his character, and it was used to drive a lot of the tension as we reach the end of the book. Having him instead just fall to and then decide to snap out of this condition that parallels the corruption of the ring just really ruins this. Now, Azog was not literally turned into any specific Lord of the Rings character, but he was changed and overemphasized in a way meant to capture something Lord of the Rings-ish. The movies did not seem content to have the dwarves just naturally encountering goblins as they traveled across Middle-earth. They wanted the kind of persistent, organized pursuit by orcs that you would have seen in the earlier movies. They wanted those orcs to have a recognizable leader. And this just doesn't work in The Hobbit. Throwing that kind of extra bad guy and rivalry into the middle of the story muddies the dramatic stakes and misdirects the audience's emotional investment. It's a gratuitous distraction before we point out that, of course, he's part of Sauron's plot, which means that once again, Lord of the Rings is jumping in front of the screen trying to distract us from The Hobbit. Now, as for Gandalf, I said he's turned into Lord of the Rings Gandalf, and here I'm going to admit that the movies had a big challenge on its hands, which is the public's perception of Gandalf. Gandalf, as represented in the original Hobbit book, was a much simpler character than he became later. He was basically just a wizard. He was a generic wizard character who showed up to bring an adventure to Bilbo's doorstep, and he kind of personified Bilbo's own personal sense of adventure. I talk about this some in the previous video. So when Gandalf shows up, no matter what the filmmakers do, the audience is going to see the more developed, serious Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings movies. I don't know if they could totally stop that. However, I think they could have tried to mitigate it. They could have pared down his character, characterized him in a way that would have suggested the Hobbit type of general wizard character, even if the audience would kind of see the other stuff. At the very least, they could have just had him function the way that the Hobbit Gandalf did. They could have him just be the person who prodded Bilbo toward adventure, showed up when the story needed him to help them, left when the story needed the dwarves to have to fend for themselves, and keep it as simple as that. Instead, the movies just leaned as hard as they could into him being Lord of the Rings Gandalf. He was involved in much more serious business than the Hobbit's quest. He had to go off and deal with a necromancer, stuff like that. This did happen in the books, but it was totally sidelined and the focus was on the dwarf's quest and of Bilbo's character development. This is something I'm going to talk about a lot more later as we get toward the end here, how it shifted the whole focus from the Hobbit plot to Lord of the Rings plot, but Gandalf's characterization definitely was a big part of that. When he's always this Gandalf character who has more important Lord of the Rings business to do than the Hobbit business, it confuses what the whole movie's about. And finally, Legolas in this movie was just uncalled for. He was only there to be a character from Lord of the Rings, and his over-the-top, cooler than everybody else in the world action hero antics just distracted from all the other characters and everything else happening in the story, as well as, like a lot of other stuff, just minimizing the actual feeling anybody's in danger or any actual stakes. If you can't tell, I hate that he was in these movies. Number 4. They mess up anything that had any thematic value in the book. The Hobbit is not a super complex book, especially compared to, say, Lord of the Rings. It doesn't have a ton of elaborate world building, and it's largely a series of pretty easy-to-read adventure episodes. This can make it look like kind of a blank slate for adaptation, like it's just kind of begging for someone to come in and flesh it out with their own action flourishes, comic relief, personal thematic interpretations, or, of course, Lord of the Rings content. But this is not the case. The simplicity of the story does not mean that nothing's going on. Tolkien's very clever about conveying a lot of characterization and themes through details. So when someone, say Peter Jackson, doesn't understand this, he takes those details as being inconsequential and doesn't understand what he's doing when he's changing them. We can see a clear example of this early on in the story with the fight against the trolls. This looks like a basic adventure episode. Bilbo and the dwarves get captured by trolls, and then Gandalf comes along and distracts the trolls until the sun comes up and turns them to stone, so he saves them. Simple as that. But the book uses this for a lot more than that. It starts with the trolls complaining about travel immediately after showing Bilbo getting annoyed with travel, thus using them to show just how ugly his complaining is. The whole reason they encounter the trolls is that they see a fire in the distance and, wet and uncomfortable and not able to start a fire themselves, they send Bilbo to go check it out. This is a formula Tolkien uses to show characters being tempted by the possibility of comfort and wandering off course, and he repeats it in Mirkwood. Just as things get hard, our heroes see a fire and think, wow, that looks nice, so they go over to it and get in trouble. And finally, this shows just how immature Bilbo's first attempt at heroism is and how badly he fell on his face when he tried it. Basically, he wandered into the trolls' camp for totally frivolous reasons. He just wanted to prove to the dwarves that he was good for something, and he ended up getting in trouble. But what triggers the encounter with trolls in the movies? They steal the dwarves' ponies. And this shows me that the movies have no clue what Tolkien was trying to do here. They don't see how the entire chapter was setting the trolls up to parallel Bilbo's attitude. They don't see the motif of being tempted by fire, or how this episode just showed the general immaturity of all involved. No. The scene is just an encounter with monsters, and so any surrounding circumstances must have just been Tolkien trying to maneuver them to that encounter. And who cares if a movie uses a different set of circumstances to do the same thing? So they just prompt this action set piece in the most generic way possible. Uh-oh, someone stole the pony, so they need to get them back. Time for a fight against monsters! And there is a lot of fighting, unlike in the book where they just kind of get grabbed, because what else is this scene for? So if the encounter with the trolls was reduced to a simple action scene, now let's look at one that was reduced to simple comic relief. And that is the episode at Bjorn's house. That guy who turns into a bear? The change to the scene isn't super important, but it's a good illustration of how the movies just flatly don't understand the story. In the book, Gandalf has the dwarves approach Bjorn's house in ones and twos because he's super temperamental and doesn't like company. Gandalf knows this from the beginning, so he plans this all out before they arrive. Which obviously parallels how they approach Bilbo. And this is fun. It kind of shows the backstory of how they arrived at his house in Chapter 1 and shows that Gandalf has a thoughtful, if formulaic way of approaching people who are standoffish. But what happens in the movie? They just go into Bjorn's house without permission when he's not there. But suddenly they realize he's coming back. So Gandalf brings them out of the house in ones or twos so they'll be in less trouble because it looks like not as many people broke in. And why? Seriously, all this gets us is another laugh at our protagonist for acting like obnoxious, socially unaware children. And I know that this isn't a super important scene in the book, so not a ton was lost here, but it just shows how totally oblivious the movies are to the source material and was just unnecessary and stupid. I just hate it. Now there is one more scene that's way more impactful, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk about two thematically important objects, the ring and the Arkenstone. In the book, these two objects are used straightforwardly for a pretty simple thematic purpose. They're objects of people's greed. The book uses retreating underground with wealth as a symbol for greed, and the ring and the Arkenstone boil this tendency down to its purest essence by giving characters a single object to fixate on. Gollum fixates on the ring and Thorin fixates on the Arkenstone. And the parallel between these two shows the path that Thorin is on. That's pretty much the full point of these objects, except for the fact that the ring doubles as a plot device that lets Bilbo turn invisible. But the movies, of course, won't abide this kind of streamlined, thematically clear simplicity. So they pile on a bunch of extraneous lore and other complications that muddy the point the book was trying to make. The ring, of course, gets turned into the Lord of the Rings ring, which is kind of understandable. Like Gandalf, the ring is so culturally familiar that it's kind of hard for modern audiences to look at it without seeing the Lord of the Rings ring. That's fine, I get that. But this shouldn't have been too hard for the movies to work around. Because unlike Gandalf, the ring doesn't have any personality, at least any inherent obvious on-screen personality. It's just an object. So really all you have to do is pare that object's function down to where it's used in the movies the way it was used in the book. Show Gollum being obsessed by it, and then just show Bilbo using it as a way to turn invisible for the sake of the adventure. Just keep it like that. Instead, of course, the movies have to lean into the Lord of the Rings thing as hard as they can. So whenever the ring's used, it's constantly showing, ominous Lord of the Rings music. It shows Bilbo getting a little too aggressive about it sometimes, and they even show the same Sauron is watching you effects. So, they weren't even really trying. And by not trying, I mean actively trying to lean into Lord of the Rings instead of just being the Hobbit. The Arkenstone's treatment is even more baffling because there was no existing lore for the filmmakers to seek out and trip over. They actually had to make their own lore and then choose to trip over it. So they turned the Arkenstone from a simple object of Thorin's greed to a MacGuffin that he needs to find before the dwarves of the world will recognize him as their king. And this is frankly stupid. It's nonsensical on its face, like why would the dwarves recognize him as a king or not depending on whether he has his hands on a gem? And it's ruinous to the point the book was making. Not only is it a distraction, but it actually legitimizes Thorin's obsession by the Arkenstone by turning it into something that he needs to unite his people. Why? Why would they do this? Whatever. And finally, let's get into that last super impactful scene I was telling you about. Their stop at Lake Town. Now, taken literally, Lake Town is just a staging point for the dwarves to rest and stock up for their trip up the Lonely Mountain. But, and you might not be surprised to hear me say this, the book uses it for even more than that. Lake Town is the most obviously modern society in the book, so much so that people, doubt legends of heroism and stuff like that. And within this setting, we're shown two men who represent the clash between commercial modernity and ancient heroism. These are the Master of Lake Town, the typical leader of a modern business-driven society, and Bard, who to put it simply is your typical ancient warrior, a great archer and natural leader descended from the last Lord of Dale. But what do the movies do? They turn Bard into a down-on-his-luck peasant who rises to the occasion and proves himself as a hero, because of course that's a cheap, easy way to manufacture audience satisfaction, and reduce the Master of Lake Town into a greedy cartoon villain who steals from his people and also acts silly. Because of course, what about these movies so far made you think they weren't going to do that? And what effect does this have on the story? It makes it worse. Because the point the book was making here is that these were just different men for different times. When there's fighting to be done, you need someone like Bard from the Age of Heroes. When society gets bigger and things get more complicated, you need someone like the Master who has a head for business. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you the book doesn't favor Bard, because it clearly does. But it's telling us that each of these men is useful under the right circumstances. Remove them from these circumstances, and one just kind of lays dormant until he's needed, and the other becomes useless and cowardly. And this accentuates the book's whole idea of modernity versus the ancient age of adventure. It also kind of says something about Bilbo and how he adapts. He's more like the Master of Lake Town than that he's more fit for modern society. And so just as these two men are in their element in one situation and out of it in the other, Bilbo kind of has to cross over from one to the other. And I like how this kind of illustrates that part of his journey. But the movie sacrifices even this relative level of nuance at one of the most thematically pivotal points in the book just to give us an inspirational hero to cheer for and a melodramatic villain to jeer at. It's juvenile even by Hollywood standards. Anyway, number 5. They sideline Bilbo and mess up the whole point of his journey. This is the problem that these movies are probably most famous for. De-emphasizing Bilbo as the main character and turning it into a rousing tale of little Aragorn and his merry men, or whatever random clutter like show-stealing elves they decide to toss into the story at any particular moment. Now, I think we all know this when we see it, but it can be a tricky thing to expound upon. Like, how do you prove that the emphasis is taken off Bilbo? Tally up the amount of time devoted to him in the book versus the movies? Belabor examples of side quests that distract from his experience? Maybe, but that would be inefficient and, well, tedious. So instead, I want to focus on how the book shows Bilbo growing as a hero, which it does pretty methodically. Once you establish that, you can see how the book by comparison makes a mess of the whole thing. After the opening and the clumsy, disastrous troll episode, which I've already covered, the book kind of progressively shows Bilbo getting braver and applying his modern-day skills to adventure. Whereas the movies, just don't, or at least muddy the whole thing. The book shows Bilbo kind of wavering between immature enthusiasm for adventure and immature complaining about how hard adventure is, or just making a half-baked attempt to show off. But he experiences a lot of growth after that, most of it marked in 3 distinct episodes. First is down under Goblin Town. Separated from the dwarves, he's all alone, lost way underground. This is probably the most danger he's been in all on his own, and so his first instinct is to soothe himself by reaching for some tobacco. But then there's this pivotal moment where instead his hand hits the hilt of his sword and there's kind of this awakening within him. He's like, hey, I gotta get down to business here and take care of myself. And so from here, of course, he wins his riddle contest with Gollum, manages to keep his wits about himself and escape out past Goblin Town and meet the dwarves out in the open. This is a huge moment for him, and to be fair, I think the movies do treat this scene with respect, even though I don't think they necessarily tie it into the bigger context of what's going on with Bilbo. From there, he starts to shine more and more in Mirkwood. The dwarves are actually impressed by his previous escape, and they start turning to him more and more for advice. And of course, when the spiders attack, he's the only one who keeps his wits about and fights them off. He uses a combination of strategy and some skills throwing things, which he'd learned from childhood and from playing darts in pubs and stuff like that. And he actually saves the dwarves, which is a really huge moment. The movie treatment of Mirkwood has none of this and is just super weird, by the way. It substitutes them just being stuck in darkness and eventually losing their nerve for some weird magic disorientation. Then the barrel scene. Yes, we all know how famously terrible this is, but I'm not sure everybody understands how thoroughly this ruins a huge stage in Bilbo's character development. Because a few major things happen here. He takes charge of the entire escape from the elves. There's this almost complete role reversal where Bilbo has become resolute and pragmatic, where the elves are now complaining about the discomfort of being stuck in barrels. And the entire ride down the river is this monumental feat of endurance and planning, which is a new high for Bilbo. Basically, he's come full circle and is now taking the lead in the adventure. But what do the movies do with this? Turn it into an inexcusably silly action scene between elves who should be the bad guys at this point in the story, orcs who shouldn't be there at all, and dwarves who are sneaking out of Mirkwood by sticking out of the top of open barrels that are somehow floating. Basically, in classic Hobbit movie fashion, it takes the peak of Bilbo's journey and turns it into a mess, just a bunch of over-the-top action and slapstick comedy. Now, Bilbo does do more after these 3 episodes. He helps the dwarves get into the side door of the Lonely Mountain, he finds out Smaug's weak spot so that he can be defeated, and he also takes the Arkenstone and uses it to help bargain against Thorin. So he's actually willing to identify the right thing to do and kind of turn against the dwarves in a way. Not totally betraying them, but, doing what's right in their best interest along with everybody else's. But by that point, he's pretty much taken the lead in the adventure, and I see most of his growth happening across these 3 episodes. They give us a private act of courage, for which he's soon recognized by the dwarves, public acts of courage in which he's looked to contribute to the adventure and saves the dwarves, and finally fully taking charge and orchestrating the course of the journey. This arc pretty much resolves one of the book's core questions. Can Bilbo contribute anything to an adventure? And it does this by showing him using his wit along with skills that are unique to him as a modern character. And this is key. If he had just picked up a sword and started slaying all kinds of orcs and everything like that, that would just be silly and miss the point, right? So what does Bilbo's arc look like in the movies? Well, the dwarves don't like him, but then one day he saves Thorin's life by rushing in and shoving an orc off him, and from then on, Thorin thinks he's a good, brave hobbit. And just for good measure, yes, Bilbo suddenly picks up a sword and defeats a trained orc warrior in single combat. Now, a lot of people have complained about how ruinous this is to Bilbo's journey. He finds his courage and wins Thorin's approval in the first movie. So where do you go from there? You have 2 more movies and no more room for him to grow, which might be part of why he's sidelined and the things he does do after this seem meaningless. His arc's been resolved. This seems broadly identified as a huge place where the movies went wrong, and I agree. But it's also worth pointing out how much of the book's arc this single act erased. His long, complex process of adapting to adventure? Gone. The clever exploration of how his more modern, civilized skill set can be of use? Gone. Instead, the movies spoon-feed their audience a typical Hollywood signifier that he's brave now, which basically rushes us past Bilbo so we can focus on the dwarves' quest. It also makes the Mirkwood and barrel scenes feel aimless, like what are we doing with them if Bilbo's not growing, which might be why Jackson filled them with all this pointless clutter. Now, before moving on, I want to point to one more thing that just gives a really clear example of how Bilbo was sidelined, and that's the Battle of the 5 Armies. Now, a lot of people complain that he was knocked out and didn't experience any of this battle, so it kind of just took him out of the story. But that happened in the book too. The difference was the book told this whole thing from his perspective. We don't actually see most of it. We see Bilbo decide to go hang by the Elf King during the battle, get hit on the head and pass out, and the next thing we know, he's awake. And we learn about the battle as he's hearing about it afterward. This frames it all from his perspective and his reaction to it. And his reaction to it is he does not like war. He starts with this romanticized view of adventure, he grows as an adventurer, But then when he finds out the results of the war, all the people who died and how pointless it was, he realizes war's not that great, and it kind of rounds off his perspective a little bit. The movie, on the other hand, shows us the battle for a long time, turning the climax of the movie into an action set piece that he's not even there for. And how do you more clearly signal to your audience that someone's not the main character, especially when you're using this opportunity to let all the other characters show off and, do action scenes and stuff? Okay, so I simplified a bit here. The movie actually has Bilbo participating in the battle before being knocked out, but it still shows it continuing with a lot of focus on the heroism and rivalries of other characters, so the point's the same. If anything, his active combat participation is just one more way of making this typical Hollywood action at the expense of his character. By this point, especially when an entire third movie is devoted to this battle, it's clear this isn't about Bilbo. Number 6. They don't even tell the story of the Hobbit and instead reduce the events of the story into foreshadowing for The Lord of the Rings. Now, I know it can be especially challenging to make a Hobbit movie after having made a Lord of the Rings movie. You have to try that much harder to keep your story out from under the shadow of another story that's not only bigger in scope and consequence, but has become a huge cultural phenomenon. But it can be done. You just need to focus on your current story. Is Sauron out there? Sure. But that's not what we're worried about today. And you know what? Our characters aren't even aware of him. So for today, we're worried about a dragon. And in this movie, he's the biggest, most dangerous thing in the world. But the Hobbit movies have no interest in that approach at all. They are just hell-bent on reminding us of Lord of the Rings to the point of constantly waving Sauron in our faces and screaming, "Hey, remember that the stuff you're watching now is not nearly as important as the stuff that's going to happen afterward." And of course, by this I'm referring to the focus on the necromancer. Now, this is where the movies show their most brazen disrespect for the source material. The necromancer is like nothing in the book. It's just a title that Gandalf alludes to like 3 times. Once he says he found Thorin's father in the necromancer's dungeon, mentioning he's more powerful than all the dwarves put together. Another time he says, "Ooh, you don't want to go there, that's where the necromancer lives." And then after the quest is over, there's a quick conversation about how a council of wizards defeated him. That's literally it. Now, to clear the air, yes, I know the necromancer is identified as Sauron later in other materials. But that's not the role he plays in this specific story. Basically, in the book, Tolkien just needed an excuse for Gandalf to have to go out on other wizard business when he wanted the dwarves to have to fend for themselves, and the necromancer is just the name he gave to this plot device. So when your adaptation takes a character that's so powerful yet so peripheral to the story and turns them into a core part of it, you're creating a huge distraction, and it's almost certain you're going to tell a story that's different from the one you're supposed to be adapting. At its core, The Hobbit is a story of Bilbo learning about adventure by helping some dwarves get their gold back from a dragon. That's the core concern of the protagonist, so it needs to be the core concern of the audience. But who cares what Bilbo and dwarves are up to if every time Gandalf leaves, we follow him and find out that he's dealing with the end of the world? What is Smaug other than a brief side quest if everything he's doing is part of Sauron's plan? Remember, the dragons had a very specific function in this book. They are there to be this new force sweeping across Middle-earth, destroying entire landscapes, consolidating wealth, making the world an impossible place for people like the dwarves to function. They were their own unique phenomena, and they were part of the change that Middle-earth was going through. Some of this change was just inevitable, and some of it could be fought, but that's what the characters were contending with. And it kind of helped us see this shift from older ages of adventure and magic to, more modern times. I guess in short, the dragons were just the most obvious and violent part of this change. Now, I guess some of this could be and was conveyed in the movies. But it was conveyed in little bits and pieces. It was mixed in with all this sloppy combination of Lord of the Rings and silly nonsense and stuff like that. So it was all just kind of mixed in or overshadowed to the point it lost its meaning, and none of the major connections were there. The Hobbit needed room to breathe, to be its own story, to have its themes shine through, to have its stakes be important for their own sake. And the movie did not pay this basic respect in any way at all. It shifted its focus away from Bilbo. It muddied even the story of the dwarves and everything into this whole big Lord of the Rings thing. And I don't know, it failed to tell a story that was maybe simple but kind of cool in its own right, that had its own flavor. And I just kind of hate that happened.